Good morning. So it's a privilege for me to stand here in front of you today, and it's an absolute honour for me to be sharing this podium with the experts that are Ira and Jeffrey. Now, the way it's going to work is I'm going to talk about myself for a few minutes, and then Jeffrey and Ira will do the same. And then after that, we'll have a little conversation where I'll ask them some questions and we'll have a conversation around D&I. And after that, if there's time, which I'm sure there will be, we'll put it open to questions in the audience. Is that okay? Okay, so, name's Tunde. As Rob said, I run this amazing charity called Making the Leap. We're a social mobility charity. What does that mean? We do 4 things. We do more than 4 things, but I'll break them down into 4 things. So the 4 things are, 1, we go into schools that have large numbers of pupils from socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds, and we go there, and I was just seeing somebody that I'm, a good friend of mine. And we go there, and we deliver training that's there to boost their employability and their soft skills. The second thing we do is we work with older young people from the same demographic, and we work with them with a more intensive soft skills intervention with the aim of trying to support them into the types of work that will enable them to work their way out of poverty. The third thing we do is we work with corporates and public sector organizations, and we work with them to support them around 2 of their diversity priorities. Those diversity priorities being either social mobility and or race. And the 4th thing we do is actually the thing that we started to do the latest, but it may be the thing that you've heard of if you haven't heard of us as Making a Leap. And that is, 4 years ago, we decided we wanted to do more to advance social mobility than we could do ourselves. And so we thought to ourselves that what we would do is encourage businesses to do more around social mobility. And so we set up this awards event, which has taken off and has been really well received, called the UK Social Mobility Awards, which is the first national awards event dedicated to social mobility. So, that's me, that's what I do. Oh, I'll tell you a little bit about me. As well as that, I'm trained to be an executive coach, and I also do consultancy around race. And the last thing I do is I host this really great podcast called the Social Mobility Podcast, where I talk to some amazing people around all matters of equality and diversity, but with a particular focus on addressing socioeconomic disadvantage. And it's a great podcast, not because of me, of course, but because I do what I do, which is get great people on the pod. Okay, so, open and honest conversations. I'm going to talk about one particular situation whereby you've got this great company, and it's a great company that focuses on diversity. Diversity is really important to this company. And it's doing good things around gender, it's doing good things around disability, but wasn't doing quite as well on race. And it wasn't doing quite as well as race because it just didn't realize it was an issue. And then when it became aware that it was an issue, I was called in, and we started to have a conversation about what we could do. And the first thing that we decided that needed to be done was to have an open and honest conversation. We needed to speak to those people from racial minorities so that we could hear their story, so they could speak their truth. And it was really important to do that. It was really important to give them an opportunity in a way that they felt safe, so they could talk about their experience at that company. And so what we did was decide to have a series of one-to-one interviews built around the questionnaire. And we had these one-to-one interviews, lasted about 90 minutes each. And they were given an opportunity to share with me, because it was decided it was best to have an intermediary so that people could feel really comfortable and confident about talking about what they wanted to talk about. And they had this conversation with me, and they shared how they felt about the numbers of racial minority people in the organization, how valued they felt, whether they felt they could progress in the organization. And so I was able to gain some really rich and powerful data. It was for me, listening to it, it was a really powerful experience. And I think for some of those that I spoke with too. So having the conversation was the first thing. But the other thing was then, what do you do with that information? How do you report that information back? And you want to report that information back in a way that it's received so that things can be done with it. And when I got the information and compiled it into a report, looking at it in just the pure narrative, it looked really harsh. And I was concerned that if it was just delivered in the report form, we wouldn't get the positive outcomes from it that we wanted to get. So what we did was we turned the report into an illustration, and then I decided that what would happen is I would have a series of presentations where I talk over the illustrations to various groups. And the groups that we spoke to were first and foremost, and they were the most important, were the participants, those who'd given the data in the first place, to the senior leadership team, and to the management team. Now, what I would say is this. Since then, and since the company thought about it and talked about it, since then there has been change. There's been an increase in the numbers of racial minorities employed by that organization. The company is aware of it and is putting things in place to try and make sure that people not only are in the organization, but are given an opportunity to be promoted and progress and be supported. And so what I'm saying is, having those open and honest conversations are the beginning point in starting to make change happen in organizations. So, that's me. Now, what's going to happen is Ira and Jeffrey are going to share a little bit about who they are and their experiences in this.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Ira Reid. I'm the Global Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Diageo. If you don't know who Diageo is, you may know some of our brands, such as Johnny Walker, Tanqueray and Smirnoff. And I've been working there. Got to get that in, sorry. And it's great working there. I've got a background as a lawyer, and I've worked in data and engineering. So working in a business which is very sort of advertising, marketing oriented is really interesting. In terms of the field of inclusion diversity, I guess you could say that my legal background brought me to a sort of natural understanding of how things need to happen. And I think that's something that's in your personality. Sometimes if you feel injustice, it can bother you. I wish it didn't sometimes. And that definitely drew me towards the field of inclusion diversity. But also, it's been an education, and it continues to be an education where I'm learning about the subject, but I'm also learning about myself and my own flaws. And I think what I would say about this topic as a whole, and Tunde summarised it really well, but with open and honest conversations, part of that dialogue is with ourselves, and it's hard. In fact, my son, who's going to be 10 next week, Maxim, he's a great leveler because he's always putting me in my place. And when I'm talking about inclusion and diversity and this gender and that parity, and he just, he expresses it in a way that's really simple. So I think talking to someone with a different perspective from a different background is really important to validate what you feel, but also recognise that other people come from a different place. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Ira. Jeffrey.
Cool. Good morning, everyone. Sorry, getting a whole ahead of myself. So I'm Jeffrey Williams. Up until the end of last year, I was the global head of diversity and inclusion at an organisation called Thomson Reuters. You may not have heard of Thomson Reuters, but if you are in the legal profession, you may use our services or the Reuters news agency. My journey into D&I was kind of a funny one. So I started off my career in the entertainment industry. I was managing songwriters, DJs, and producers, and then kind of decided I wanted to transition and do something slightly different. So I landed in HR and was doing learning and development and talent management. While doing talent management, I had a long conversation about high potential talent and everyone that was listed as high potential, they looked differently, but came from the same kind of background and experience. So would have been to one of the Russell Group universities, will probably have an MBA or a master's, and just basically kind of had a very similar style and kind of way of being. And I found myself thinking, actually, I don't fit into that bucket myself. I've kind of come from this creative start, and how does my career fit into this organization? So I had a conversation with my line manager at the time, and he kind of said to me, actually, we need someone to do a project on gender inclusion. Would you want to lead that for the division I was working in? So I went off and I started this project, and effectively completed a bunch of focus groups with men and women in our organization, and got to understand how they viewed the business, and they actually viewed it quite differently. So then if we were having these people view the organization in such different ways, how could we then have this conversation of inclusion? So once completing that project, I then moved into the global D&I team, which was newly formed, and again kind of revisited the work that I'd done on the gender piece, really talking about inclusion, getting to understand how our policies showed up, who were using our policies, and how does that kind of really connect to them progressing in our organization. I think, for me personally, as Ira said, it's very much about being reflective on my own learnings and my need to understand different communities. I have my experience and where I've come from, and I understand those layers, but then how do I tap into those people around me to get to understand their experiences and what they've learned? I think, thinking about open and honest conversations, it's about answering those questions and being willing to receive what people say. Because I think, thinking about Tunde's example, when they are having conversations around race, it's difficult because we've all experienced the world in different ways. So how do we then have an organizational conversation to make sure that what your company stands for is where you move forward to? So I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions and also sharing a bit more about my narrative.
Jeffrey, Ira, thank you. Okay, so let's get in with the questions. So what would you say is the value to organizations of having diverse and inclusive business practices?
So I think there's a lot of data out there that shows that diverse leadership leads to successful business outcomes. So when we think about inclusion, particularly that's the business enabler that allows us to leverage the value of diversity. So I always think about it as two boxes with two separate and distinct approaches. You've got diversity, visible and invisible, and you've got inclusion where you're trying to get the competitive advantage in a business from a team or from a group of people or from different perspectives. And it's really it's really clear that we have successful business outcomes, whether it's due to gender parity or other types of diversity. But it's also about recognizing that it's so much more than just a conversation about the shareholders or something that we add into non-financial reporting. It's much more than that. It's an entitlement, a basic human right that we come to work and we feel rewarded and that we recognise ourselves in the workplace, and we go home and we feel good as well. I don't use the expression work-life balance because I don't have one. I don't know anyone else who has one either. But I think it's useful to talk about priorities. How do we enable employees to balance their priorities at work and at home so that they feel good about themselves when they go home, but then when they come to work, they're fully engaged. They want to be an active contributor, not just stand at the side. And how do we think about the barriers to inclusion that are going to stop them from being at their best in the workplace?
Okay. Jeffrey, what did you say?
I think adding on to that, it's about also looking at your reputational risks and how people view you in the marketplace. So effectively, your D&I strategy and the way you communicate that to your internal employees and also in the marketplace, then hopefully will attract the brightest and the best individuals to come and work for you, and also may challenge your perception of what the brightest and the best are. So they may not have always gone to Oxford or gone to the top schools, but someone who actually is going to innovate and come up with new ideas that will help your organisation will grow and flourish. I think it's also about looking at, as you build your strategy, how do you weave it into every single angle of your organization. So not just HR, but into your PR strategy, into your comms strategy, into how your leaders develop their teams and their employees, and also looking at your brand positioning. So if you are an organization that has customers at the end of it, are you speaking to all your customers or just a minority of your customers? And I think that's something that is really key to how you have an open dialogue in the marketplace, but also build this sustainably.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I'm somebody, over the years, I collect mentors, consiglieres, I collect them. And one of mine who is chairman of one of the big professional service firms, we were having a conversation once and he was saying that what's really important to him is to have that diversity of thought around the boardroom table. You know, different people think differently. And I sit on a few boards myself, and it's quite interesting because I sit on these boards and I'm very often the only black person. I'm very often the only person from the charity space, and I'm very often the only Cockney. Somebody from a working class background speaks like I do. And it's really interesting that very often I think about different things than the other members of the board do. And I'm not saying that the things I think about are any more important than what they think about, but the fact that I think differently means that we close blind spots. We close each other's blind spots. So things they're not thinking about, I'm thinking about, and things I'm not thinking about, they're thinking about. So you reduce the amount of blind spots that are around with that diversity. So it's really important. And I think it's also important that, you know, if people are happier, if you have a more inclusive working environment, people will be happier. And if people are happier, they're going to be more productive, right? Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So, next question. So, talking about D&I, you know, what do you think size of organisation should be thinking about this and having somebody in post or having a team specifically focused on D&I? What would you say?
I would say that you need to have someone focused on this literally from the incubation of your organisation. I think a lot of companies start to think about it when they get to 1,000 people. They say, oh, actually, I think we need someone to kind of maybe set up some groups or, you know, look at our data and our numbers. But I do think this is something that you should have embedded in your organisation. And as I said earlier on, you need to think about it across many different facets. So not just in the sense of the people. And I think an example I have of this was I was buying a present for this thing called the Book of My Life. And effectively, they're a small organisation, and they basically create these books that tell the story of the year you were born and what was the hit records. And so I was on there trying to buy this present, and effectively, I couldn't find a black baby. So I emailed them and I said, oh, I'm buying this present for someone, and they're of colour, but I can't find a black baby. And they were like, well, their email response was like, why would you need a black baby? We're only a small business. And I was kind of like, wow. So then, you know, and the guy kind of responded and said, oh, we're only a team of 10. So, you know, it's really hard to source these pictures. And I kind of was like, is it really? So, you know, even when you think about this, there are so many different points where the subject of diversity and inclusion comes in. And I kind of, in a way, couldn't fault them because they were based in Amsterdam, he said. So they were probably a group of friends that had this fantastic idea, which it is, and they wanted to build this business, but they didn't think about the breadth of the organizations and people they could be reaching, considering where they were located and also the access of the internet. So I think, you know, as you think about diversity and inclusion, it's very much about embedding it from the start, thinking about how you look at your recruitment practices, how you look at your PR narrative, how you look at your comm strategy, how you look at the teams that you build and the skills that they bring, and whether there is that true level of diversity of thought. I think, you know, as more tech startups start, people are kind of creating them in their bedrooms with their friends. So then when you move beyond your friends, how do you then move, you know, think about the people that you recruit? So there are a different circle of networks that you can tap into. So I think sometimes the conversation becomes very much groupthink, and everyone's like, oh, well, I agree with you because, hey, we went to school together and we started this thing and that's the experience and isn't this fantastic? And it's about actually, if you want to grow your business, it's about being able to move at pace, being agile, but also being able to challenge that way of thinking at the right times. And I think there's definitely an opportunity to do that if you start from incubation.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I really love the points you're making. I think in terms of organisational structure, it's really tricky because it's going to depend on the type of industry you have, the kind of support you have from your executive board and the budget. The first thing I would say is it's important that whoever does the work, and it doesn't matter whether they have the title D&I or not, it's still the same work. Mm-hmm. Firstly, it's not just an HR thing, so make it clear to your business leaders that, you know, when they come up to you and they say, what are you going to do about this? Turn around to them and say, well, what are you going to do about this? I think that's what I would say. And then the second thing is really make sure that the people that have overall responsibility are supported. So think about well-being, because the three of us were talking earlier and we were saying that actually we think about teams and structure, and it's not just D&I, it could be any team. How you feel about the work when you're in a people-related job is hard. And when you have to motivate other people to be productive and you're burning out or finding it hard, that's tough. So factor that into your planning around who does what and how we influence. There's two basic ways of doing it. You can have someone who is a single person focusing on D&I. I'm just going to call it I&D because it's a bit of a bugbear of mine. In Diageo, we lead with inclusion as the behaviour, so we call it I&D. And that person then, as Jeffrey said, coordinates with other teams, so that could be talent acquisition, talent strategy, learning and development, and you integrate and you have good conversations, hopefully, with your counterparts, communication, sustainability, and you filter it through the different parts of the strategy and execute. The second way of doing it is, again, another conversation we were having earlier, is the US model, where you have a chief diversity officer, and then they have a bigger team. They report directly to the chief executive, and then you have, cluster models or market models, depending on the infrastructure. My personal view is that it's not about the amount of budget or the amount of infrastructure. It's be practical and achievable in the goals that you're setting. And actually, when you think about inclusion, it's not a corporate thing that's just been invented. It's basic incremental changes. So how do I show up at work? How do I treat the person sitting next to me? How do I treat the person who is at the coffee machine? It's these little incremental changes that are inclusion. So I would really say that regardless of structure or title, encourage people to think about values and including other people and not feel that they need a title to demonstrate the behaviours.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I would just add that, and particularly what you said, Jeffrey, about building it in from the beginning, even if you can't afford in the budget to have a person, full time, reach out. There's contractors, there's, people who can come in with expertise to support you on it. But it's about making this a priority, embedding it in your organisation and seeing it as something that you want to do something about.
Yeah. And I think a valid point was, 2 weeks ago, Morgan Stanley said that they wouldn't actually invest in an organisation that didn't have a D&I strategy process going forward. So I think, it's, as the world changes, it's definitely becoming fundamental. And I think it's also, diversity and inclusion isn't always about the visible things that we can see. It is about, as Ira was saying, about your culture, about how people connect to you and how people feel as they come in through your front door. So I think it's finding those balances as well.
Excellent. Okay, so this question is, why do you think business needs to be having these open and honest I&D? With a little nod to the era. I&D conversation.
Go on.
So why do they need to have these conversations? I think the world is smaller. So people are walking into organizations having expectations of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. And I think the business should be able to reflect that. I think, to my point earlier on, as organizations go to market and think about their products and services, they need to have the end user in mind. And the end user, comes from many different perspectives and experiences. I also feel that without having that conversation, you build companies that are very linear in their approach to whatever they're doing. And I think I was making this point earlier on when we were talking. Big business, small business, all organizations play a massive role in how the world ebbs and flows. So I think I made this point when we were speaking earlier on. If you look at LGBT inclusion and that as a topic of discussion, that was changed by big business. They kind of were sitting there and they were looking at their employees that they had in their organization and decided that they wanted to do things that would support their LGBT colleagues, making sure that they understood that they would be protected within their four walls, that they felt connected to the organization. But then that mirrored and kind of trickled out into society, and we saw more people coming out more people being visible about their identity, and that now, basically, especially in the UK, is something that's pretty normal to see and hear about in the working environment. Now, if you think about it, 20 years ago, that wasn't the norm, but business played a major part in that. So I think these conversations are the ones that basically people learn something in the working environment, they take that back to their families and they say, do you know something, you know what I learned at work today? And they share that, and then their kids and their families and their grandparents all hear these different narratives and go, actually, maybe I should change my opinion. Some people won't, because I think that's the other piece. In any subject, basically, there will be that 10% who just won't care what you're talking about. They will never engage with it, they'll never connect to it, and they'll always see it as something for someone else to do. But you need to worry about the majority, that 50 to 60%, that really want to make sure that your culture is inclusive and engaging. So I think that's why it's an important conversation to have, to be a part of your business, to make sure that, as things change and societally things happening outside of your organization, you have a position on it internally.
Thank you. Ira?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Jeffrey said, and also I think it's really complicated. So why are we having open and honest conversations in business? Because we have to. because in our business we've got 60% millennial and Gen Z, and if I turn around to one of my colleagues in that group and I give them, some spiel around the corporation, they're not going to accept it. So those employees and those people in society are not accepting it. They come with an appetite for growth and change, and they expect it. They expect fundamental learning and development to be attached to their role, whether that is self-learning or other ways of learning, and then that should be linked to talent processes. They're looking for a strong employer brand. So we live in an age where companies are being forced to invest in their employer brand in the same way that they do in their market brands. So it's really, really fundamental that people know what you stand for, considering whether they want to stay working for you or if they want to join you as an applicant. Think about things like Glassdoor and Volt. And then we know that the employee experience is really centric to everything that's happening now. It's all about experience. Even a simple example like thinking about moving from sort of classroom unconscious bias where you were told, what a failure you are because you can't do these things, to inclusive leadership or managing inclusively where you're told, experience yourself, experience others, and it's more about learning together. So that's what people are reaching out for. And the conversational piece is really, really important from an organisational perspective, because you can have great policies and processes, but do you have the uptake? So we've got a brilliant global family leave policy for men and women, regardless of gender and sexual orientation, but we don't see necessarily uptake from men that we would like. So even if you have an amazing policy or process, is it acceptable, or do people feel acceptable using that policy? Do they really feel that their career won't be hurt if they do something, or if they show up and they feel vulnerable? So the conversational piece, I think, is fundamental to getting everybody to join in and really air their true thoughts about whether they feel included or not in the workplace.
Yeah. Can I just add one point? I think one of the things that we were discussing as well earlier on was, when you discuss this subject, you're talking about everybody that works in your business, but a lot of time the conversation can flow into people of colour, women, those from the LGBT community, those living with disabilities, and the community that is often left out is the straight white men. But effectively, they are part of your inclusion strategy, they're part of your inclusion narrative, and that has to be how you bring it in, to have this holistic vision. And I think that's a key fundamental piece that all organisations need to work on and kind of build out a bit more on.
Yeah. I would just add to what you've both said by saying you need to have these conversations just because you care about your people that are working for you. You may be having people in your organisation who are suffering, who are unhappy, who don't feel valued, who don't feel that they can progress. And if you don't have these conversations, you won't know that. And the reasons that they may not be feeling as good about the organisation as they should may simply be because they don't feel heard. And they may simply be because they don't feel that they can talk about what it is that's bothering them. So I would say that's really important. Now, so the questions so far, I think experts like your good selves, I think, have been really easy for you. So I'm going to now make it a little bit. So what do you think of the current organization? Yeah. So what do you think of the current organizational and societal context in which we're having these conversations? So I'm looking for a bit of controversy now. Let's see what we do.
So I personally think they're two different conversations. They do bleed into each other, but they are two separate conversations. So, at Thomson Reuters and all the work that I've done in diversity and inclusion, I've always looked at it as a business model, a business opportunity, and something that is about growing our organisation. Now, the Me Too movement and all the other things that are happening externally and obviously political landscape, that does bleed in because effectively you're going to have people that are going to sit the left or the right of either conversation. Now you have to figure out how you then balance that, and I think one of the ways that I know that I've done that in my day-to-day roles is kind of making it about the organisation. So effectively, everybody wants to keep the lights on in their house, be able to pay their bills, have food on their table and provide for their family. And that is kind of the stringent way that I've kind of gone about making sure that people understand how we're driving diversity and inclusion at Thomson Reuters and the other places that I've worked. Because I think sometimes if you kind of go on the trend that's happening in the marketplace right now, you then get lost to the trend, and you really have to kind of make sure that everyone stays focused on your journey, on what you're trying to achieve in the work that you're doing. I think it's also imperative to then be able to have those conversations with your leaders about what is happening in the marketplace. I know at one point we did have a conversation with all of our senior leaders around Me Too and what that might mean for the business. Not that we had anyone doing anything negative, it was just like, okay, how are we going to handle some of our mentoring programs? Maybe we should ebb the flow and change it a little bit. So I think one of the projects, we actually changed it so all the mentoring conversations happened at lunchtime or somewhere, and we kind of created a space where they could go and sit together and have those conversations so people could see them and it wasn't done in private and behind closed doors. And I think it's kind of thinking about those things and really kind of making sure that, and I think the other piece that happened, which was interesting, was when we had the mass shootings of unarmed black men in the US. We did a thing called a Safe Space Call, where we invited all of our employees in the region, because we were near one of the shootings, to come and have a conversation. And we had our chief people officer join the call as well. And they just really wanted to share and talk about it, because I think the unnerving thing that happened was that no one else in the business was talking about it. So it suddenly became this thing that was happening to a community in a corner. So we kind of created something where they were able to have that conversation and come together as a community and kind of learn from each other and hear about each other's experiences and really kind of build on that. So I think it's finding that balance between the two, but also understanding that the work that you're doing is for your organisation and it's not a social justice crusade.
Ira?
I think it was the question I saw that made me stress out because it's funny when you do this kind of work, you can feel like you live in a bubble, and actually I do go home and watch the news, but it's interesting to think, how do those jigsaw pieces fit together? And that's important, because when you think about people, they don't just live in the workplace, they go out and they go home and they watch the news, and all this other stuff is important. And so I think what we can see is, with the rise of technology and social media, you see this coalescing of the voice that Tunde is talking about get louder. So if you think about the voice that wasn't able to share their thoughts 50, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, those voices get loud on social media, and it's harder for companies to ignore. So whether it's conscious consumerism or coronavirus or volatile markets or volatile politics, those issues are pervading the workplace because people bring those topics with them and they're posting, whether they're on Twitter or on LinkedIn or whatever it is. So it becomes impossible for companies to ignore and separate out those topics. And it's good people management to say, if something is happening in a relevant market and it affects culture in that country or society as a whole, why wouldn't you recognise it? If there's a local disaster or a charity event or a school event or whatever it is, companies have a responsibility and an obligation to care about the well-being of their employees, to say, I've noticed, I recognise that situation and I want to support you. Not necessarily to dictate what that support looks like, but to have a conversation around what the employee needs, because it's different for everybody. We've all had that conversations with different kinds of employees. There's the employee who needs to be signposted to get help. And then there's the employee who wants to sit down and have a really long conversation about it. And inclusion is a bit like that. It's hard to measure. So when big events happen, it's just asking the question and say, how does this tie into our people strategy from an internal perspective? Does it impact it? Should we consider it? And then separating out the dichotomy, which is the internal people piece around engagement and the external reputational piece, which is different, which is much more sustainability, ESG related. So it's very important to look at those separately and then put them together. And it's just making sure that you're aware, but not necessarily, as Jeffrey says, not necessarily reacting to everything straight away, but just keeping it in mind and reminding your people to ask the questions.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're having these conversations about diversity in a societal time that's unlike any I've seen for, 20 years. It's almost as if we've gone backwards societally. There appears to be a pushback, in my view, against what seems to be seen as unfettered wokeness, So, and I think that's a little bit of a problem. And I think those of us that are into diversity, I think we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be conscious of the fact that there are some people out there who don't believe in inclusion and diversity. And yeah.
Sorry, because when you said you feel that they're kind of pushing back, don't you feel, I personally feel that they're pushing back on the language?
Yes, absolutely.
Not necessarily on the intent of inclusion or diversity, because I think everyone wants to be included, but they're pushing back on the language of, I don't know, gender equality or, whatever it might be. They feel like that's excluding them, so that's why they're reacting the way they are?
Yeah, I would agree. I think those of us who are on our side of the fence, and clearly we've agreed about a lot, so we're all on the same side of the fence. So I think those of us that are on this side of the fence that want to advance equality and diversity, I do think we also have to be mindful. Empathy goes both ways. We want people to be empathetic of us, but I think we also have to be empathetic of the fears of those who are in the majority. And we have to be conscious of that in how we speak about things. There's a great video, I don't know if any of you have seen it, from Obama, where he talked about he's not sure whether the call-out culture, the labeling and, white male privilege, whether that was helpful. But there's definitely a pushback against that. And so I think these D&I conversations are happening with that being around.